Welcome back, everyone. We're now on to part three of Changing the World, and we're going to look at identity and the environment. So, some of the things that have influenced our ideas about identity, the ways that we relate to each other. And of course, one of the big changes over the past 30 years has been technological transformation. So the digital age has really transformed the ways that we communicate. It's created multiple modes and platforms, but actually the rollout of technology has been really fast, but also uneven. Something to consider is that, I guess, previously, 10 to 20 years ago, hardware innovations like smartphones have actually given way to software driven change. So things like apps, social media platforms, algorithmic systems, AI, big data. So, what we can actually see has occurred is not only these sorts of advancements in our the physical technology that we're using, but the ways in which we connect, how we connect, who we connect with. And a lot of the time, this is being driven by algorithms and big data. So these tools can shape how we organize, how we connect, but also how we think. So, for example, apps like WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, they allow activists to coordinate globally in real time. Algorithms on platforms like Facebook and TikTok also influence the issues that we see, our awareness of certain things, and they shape public discourse. We've also seen that this technology can disrupt particular industries. So, Uber is the classic example of redefining the ways in which the taxi system operated. And that transformed almost overnight. And we've also seen that with food delivery platforms in terms of an influence on hospitality. So, one thing to think about in relation to this is that this has created particular winners and losers. So, on the one hand, we might think that gig workers for Uber or Deliveroo are the winners because they've disrupted other people's business models. But of course, we also know that they lack proper employee protections. It's doubtful that they are well paid for what they do. They have insecurity, job insecurity, and safety concerns. So something to consider is the change in social dynamics that has occurred as a result of this. Technology doesn't just interrupt industries. It can also make changes to social movements. So one thing to consider, I talked about the fact that WhatsApp now allows activists to talk in real time globally, but the early anti-globalization movements in the early 2000s actually had to communicate by online forums and email lists. We also see now that climate activists and feminist movements use things like hashtags and social media to actually mobilize people and raise awareness. So, in these changes that have occurred, there have been winners and losers in relation to the ways in which industries have responded, and social movements have adjusted as well. Something for us to be aware of as sociologists is also that rapid change can produce anomie. So, this is Emile Durkheim's description of the processes of rapid change and the impacts that that can have on people when they feel fear or disoriented or displaced within their own communities. So people displaced by technological shifts often experience an insecurity or a nostalgia for a more stable past. We've seen this in the past with the Luddites in the early 19th century who went and actually destroyed machinery, concerned about the impact of the Industrial Revolution on factory workers. You know, they felt displaced by the technological mechanization. We could see that sort of being quite an important example. Obviously, it was not a successful social movement, but we can see it being important when we're thinking about the influence of technology now. You know, who has made these decisions that big data is allowed to have the kind of power that it yields? Who is making the decisions about where AI is allowed in or out? Well, the university's trying to, but you know, it's an ongoing process. So we can see in times of rapid change that actually it can produce social movements for change and people who resist that for various reasons. Castells was quite interested in the use of technology and the rises of technology, although you can see much earlier than social media times, or he did write about it later on, and talks about types of identities that have been shaped by these changes. And he talks about legitimating identities. So that's an identity that's promoted by government or corporations. They're seeking to reassure people that, you know, everything's okay. And you can see this playful tweet by Wendy's here as an example of that. So it's quite interesting what's happening there. So, you know, they're using humor to actually talk about McDonald's, to sort of diss on McDonald's. Remember, Wendy's in the US is actually a hamburger chain. Saying, you know, when the tweets are as broken as the ice cream machine, because whoever's in control of McDonald's Twitter account at the time actually had set up an automatic tweet but not put in the substance of what they were supposed to do. So this is a legitimating identity. You know, it's sort of just being humorous, trying to relate to the audience, showing, you know, everything's going to be okay, really not engaging in any of the sort of criticisms or anything that people would have of the different companies. So it's a means of encouraging brand loyalty and projecting stability in time. There are also resisting identities. So these are the kinds of identities, I guess the Luddites would be an example of that, of people who push back against disruption and they idealize past eras of security. So you might also think about the alt-right movements, which really sort of emphasize this idea about traditional family values, for instance, and traditional hierarchies, and actually oppose multiculturalism. So harking back to a kind of national identity that is really being quite romanticized, and wanting to go back to that. Project identities are where people are pushing for things to be more progressive. So to dismantle inequalities, to build a new social order. And many environmental movements and activists could be categorized as this. So, you know, the idea that we need an energy transition is a really prominent response and necessary response to climate change. And the argument there is, well, we'll use technology, we'll use renewables, we'll actually transform our economy to be more sustainable. So that's a project identity. You can see some of the complexities too of project identities when we consider the environment movement. The environment movement is really broad, it's multifaceted, there are many different elements and issues within it. So you could see the more sort of local campaigns about saving koalas, and you could also see the sort of broad, as I mentioned, campaigns around climate change, arguing that we need a complete transformation of our economic system. You could also look at the environment movement in terms of the kinds of organisations. So I already mentioned Greenpeace as one example of when the environment movement gets to the stage of bureaucratisation. And I also mentioned that if you look at organisations like Extinction Rebellion, they've resisted bureaucratisation and tried to stay a grassroots organisation. So you can see there the variation in the approaches that different environment groups take. And it can also depend on their audience and their issue. So, one of the things that we've seen in Australia, for instance, is the rise of the group Lock the Gate. And their focus is very much on land use conflicts and water rights. So they do talk about climate change, but not so prominently, because that organisation actually goes and talks to landholders and tries to encourage them. I mean, they started with this idea of lock the gate. You know, you put a big yellow sign on your gate saying you're not allowing gas and coal companies onto your land. So you can see there that there's quite a range of priorities in terms of the environment movement, a range of ways of organising. We already discussed the different ways in which social movements will engage in different tactics. And so, what you can see through that is quite a strong diversity. Arguably, this is quite good. I would say that it's good. You know, I guess like the big NGOs like Greenpeace, etc., have funds to put into awareness raising, and they have strong voices at the national and international level. And groups like Lock the Gate sort of work in communities. So you can see how that can be quite useful. Again, thinking back to the civil rights movement in the US as an example of that. But of course, you will also see tensions arise in that context. So, going back, I guess, to the thing about Extinction Rebellion organising protests that block public roads, a lot of the big name NGOs were very quiet about the controversy over that tactic. So, you know, there's a way for them to sort of avoid that. Usually those debates don't come out into the public. Sometimes they do. I think it was actually Extinction Rebellion in the UK who went and occupied a Greenpeace office to protest that they weren't doing enough about corporate influence on climate change policy. So you can see there how these ontological debates about what is the most important thing to tackle and how to go about doing it come about. But you can also see that there perhaps is a usefulness for the diversity there. So, if it's not already obvious, one of the reasons that this matters so much in thinking through these issues is thinking about the issue of climate change. You know, it's an urgent and universal problem. Interestingly, you know, it's a scientific problem and we know the answers to it. But what is happening is that the political solution is just not there. So I would say, arguably, that, you know, the diversity of movements working on that is a good thing. However, where we go with it is still up in the air. So I think one of the things that we could think about when it comes to climate change, and when we're thinking about that as an example of the different spheres of power in our society, is that it's often framed as an environment versus the economy debate. And thinking back to those four levels of power, you know, the political, the economic, the military, and the ideological, I would say really out of those four, at the moment, we would see that the political, the economic, and the military are not a sphere of influence that is very easy to get action on in relation to climate change. So, what we really need there is strong ideological change in terms of our values and the things that we think are important in our everyday lives. Interestingly, this does then come back to ideas about materialism, but I'll move on to that in the next lecture. What I want us to take away from this is that we can see the ways in which social change has occurred over time. We can see the roles of protest movements historically, and we can see a very urgent and complicated problem that we're engaging with now. So I'm hoping that thinking through all of these things is going to help us think further about how we can positively move forward on climate change or on the social issues that you're most concerned about as well. So, some things to take away from this section. We can look at technology and see that it can accelerate disruption and activism. So it's created new networks and new identities and ways of thinking, but it has left some people behind. We could also use Castell's framework to think about the ways in which our identities function in terms of power relations. So, legitimizing, resisting, project identities, thinking about how we respond to change. If we look at environmental movements, they are super diverse. They have a range of issues, a range of tactics, and a range of different types of organisation. So we can apply this knowledge to thinking about particular issues. I illustrated it. I used the issue of climate change to illustrate it, but I think you could also look at social change processes and protest movements and think about, how could we improve the incarceration of Indigenous people, as in reduce it? How could we improve the availability of housing in Australia? All of these issues are things that we want to take technology, social change into consideration for. Okay, so we're going to come back for our final section in a minute or however long you need a break for, and we're going to discuss where sociology has gone within this context and this process of social change and how we might further mobilise it to create social change.